individual experience, then that helps us to reflect on the fact that, you know, geography is just one factor to consider. Culture, company or territorial culture is another factor to consider. Where we are in our lives is another factor to consider. And, you know, Michael knows one of the things that I like to remind everybody when we try to kind of put boxes around things is that for me, we have only one race in the world, and that is the human race. And in the human race, we have many individuals, and they are come in different shapes and forms, different places in their lives, and therefore have different experiences of change. Now, what I've just shared with everybody might feel a bit, on the one hand, a bit too pink and fluffy and touchy-feely, and on the other hand, might feel a bit mind-blowing. Because what's mind-blowing about it is it means that you can't go by a set of rules that say you do this in this situation and that in that situation. You go by the individual. So I don't know whether that answered your question, Daylon. I think we can certainly move into some areas about where a different kind of modality works well and where it doesn't work well. But I'm not sure that very big buckets of definition help us with this challenge of helping individuals be successful as they go through change.
Yeah, and just to add slightly to that, one of the mantras that we try and get people to internalize is that successful change happens one person at a time. You have to deal with the individual, and the complexity and many of the changes that we work with our clients on comes not from the change itself. Some of these changes are relatively simple. It comes with the number of people and the variety of people in different cultures and backgrounds, and as Rhiannon says, at different points in their lives, and the impact that this change is having on them personally. And how do you systematically take such a diverse group of as that through a change to what is usually a fairly challenging timeline that the business is expecting?
Well, thank you for that. And I think one important thing that I took away from what you both just said is let's not ignore the human being in this process, and that it's very important to look at the human being as an individual, and not just sort of generalize them or look at it as a statistic in this process. So when we're dealing with change management, let's get into maybe some stories and some examples. You know, is there any stories that you could share of this practice that you did in Asia Pacific specifically? Yeah.
In what context? Any particular context, Daylon?
I'll leave that up to you. Any story that you find interesting that maybe have some lessons that we can take away from? Yeah.
Well, I think some of the we won't obviously name individual clients, but you know, some of the key things I think to take away from all of the changes that we've worked on is that we try and teach people that change is a process, and that if you that when you first hear it is quite a big reframing of people's thought process, because change is typically seen as being something that's nebulous and difficult to do and all those kinds of things. But if you say to people, well, actually, we can translate this into a process, and a process that has steps and repeatable steps and has tools and a structure behind that process, that can help people to then surface their own reservations and their own challenges with an individual change if they understand where they are in that process. So if you can explain to people that change is a process, it has a certain amount of steps, people feel more comfortable about surfacing where they are on the journey of going through that change. And we know, just to get back to your point about some difference between Eastern and Western cultures in general, is that people here are more reticent to surface how they really feel about the impact of a change on them as an individual, because that's culturally challenging the group, and challenging seniority is culturally more difficult here than it would be, say, in Western cultures. So by teaching people here, particularly that change is a process that helps people to feel a bit more comfortable in coming forward with their perfectly reasonable challenges with a change that may be impacting them.
So what I'm hearing is a level of psychological safety is needed in this process, but also at the same time to be distinctly aware there is some differences in terms of power distance between the East and the West cultures. Yeah.
Absolutely, and power distance is one of the, as you know, one of the cultural dimensions that's important in looking at different cultures, and the centralization of power control with that. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Michael. And Rhiannon, do you have a particularly memorable story or something that you might be able to share from your experiences?
Yeah, I think what I've been thinking about as we've been talking is in those heydays pre-pandemic, I found myself in a really bizarre situation because I was asked by a very well-known bank to go and run the same training program in 5 different countries in Asia. And even before this experience, I had always balked when people in my classrooms here in Singapore would talk about Asian culture. There was always something about that didn't sit quite right with me, but I couldn't really get to the bottom of it because I'd only really been to other parts of Asia on holiday. I didn't feel that I'd had that kind of true exposure into the same workplace. Now, what an opportunity, because I got to work with a team of people in each of these countries, each team doing the same job, essentially, but in their own culture. And I was running the same training course with the same material. And, if I ever was in doubt, what it reminded me was 2 things. It reminded me of how much is the same and how much is different at the same time. So in terms of what was the same, I was nervous, of course, about whether this change management process that Michael's been describing would resonate in each country. And I didn't need to worry about that at all. The resonance was there. Everybody kind of got it and got it very quickly, both in terms of the philosophy of change management. Why should we pay attention to the people side of change? And also to the very kind of sensible set of steps that we should go through and the roles that people should play. No problem with that at all. The way in which I found those groups needed to find their resonance with it was quite different. So I went to Indonesia, and in Indonesia, I understood very quickly that the relationship that I needed to build with the group I had was where they were allowed in small groups, in safe spaces with one another, to discover things that I then gave them a creative way to play back. That worked really well in Indonesia. In India, I needed to give everybody voice space, because that was what really brought the energy into the room, which was giving everybody a voice in front of the whole group. So I think maybe that is a kind of interesting story. I don't know, for people who are listening to this and needing to work in different places. Now, the fact was, I didn't really know all of this before I started. I mean, I do try to read up a little bit about behavior and, not typecast behavior, but be ready to accommodate and celebrate the behavior that I encounter in any part of the world that I'm working. But I'm hoping that, I wasn't any expert, but by really tuning in and understanding that this learning was a change for the people in the room, and therefore that I needed to see them as individuals and understand how they could absorb this change, that was a real inspiration for then how to connect with them around the material.
And I can see from your process, you exercise a lot of empathy and cultural sensitivity in terms of helping them to find that psychological safety that you mentioned. And you mentioned in different cultures, people find psychological safety in different ways, like in India, it being like a public discourse, and in Indonesia being more of a private small group discussion. I think that's very, very important, even though you're delivering on the same content and the material. Have you ever, either of you ever been in a situation where you've met participants, or you met people in the organization where they are not on board with this process? Yeah.
Every training course, how about that? For the last 8 years? Yes.
Okay, so how do we manage that, or how do you get them on the boat? I have a client who happens to love to call it like, we need to get people on the boat, or we'll be sailing off. Yeah,
that's fine as an example. Yeah, I mean, what we do is we celebrate resistance to change. Nobody likes change, and I think sometimes in organizations there's an expectation that we need to get everybody to like the change that is coming, and we always say to people that is unrealistic expectation. What we need is for people to choose to participate in the change themselves, and it's by phrasing it like that, where the onus is on the individual making an active choice to participate in the change, you then can get into a conversation with somebody about what is it that's worrying you about this change. Why do you find it a challenge? What would help you to feel less worried about the change? And if you choose to take the time to engage people in those conversations, then we find that that's very valuable as a way of getting people on board with change. And that's what we encourage organizations, is not to try and force resistance away, but actually to surface it and recognize it's natural. We all have it. Nobody likes change. We just have to understand what it would take for each person to choose to buy into that change.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think when someone chooses something, it's much more powerful, and they are more committed to the process as well, as I understand.
We just another point on that, Daylon. Sometimes we get asked, can you have someone buy into a change where, if the change is successful, the natural conclusion is that that person may have to leave the organization? And there are many changes like that going on globally right now, where people are being moved to a shared service center in another region or whatever, and they don't transfer to that shared service center. There's many examples of this going on. The answer is absolutely yes. You can have the people who are required to make that transition a success buy into that process, even though they know that should the process be successful, they will be leaving the organization. And in fact, our argument is it's even more important that you engage those people properly in that process, because they do know, they're adults, they're not children. They recognize that they are going to have to leave the organization. And as the organization itself has a choice as to how it will treat those people going through that difficult transition. So absolutely, this is a mechanism and a process for supporting people to go through difficult changes like that.
I think that's a great point. And just to ask as well as a follow-up question, who are the key people in the organization that you usually work with to help you with this process? I would imagine the CEO would need to be on board first, but like, who else? Yeah.
Rhiannon, do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah, so actually I'm going to connect that to that previous question about do we have people who push back, and where there's antipathy to this whole idea of change management. And so the connecting point is that, of course, what we find in many cases is that senior leaders think that change management could be the answer to everything, but the people who need to change are not them. And so actually it comes as something of a shock when we help them to understand, guide them to material that they can reflect on for themselves. But when they come to an understanding that they are very, very influential with regards to the climate that's being created for change to happen. So let's take even something like the word transformation. You know, I mean, there's an obsession with the word transformation, and the more senior you are, the more you try to fit the word transformation into your everyday conversation. The fact is that if you are ground staff, if you are there to serve customers, beneficiaries, whatever it is, transformation is one of your most hated words. So it's interesting because, you know, the leader has got a very big change to make potentially with themselves, both in terms of the process and practice they follow, but really importantly with regards to behavior. And of course, the only way we can really get great behavior change is if we also get some mindset change. So that's one role, is around the leadership piece. But unfortunately, you can't just go on a change management course, you know, get a nice template and then be a great leader of change. It takes a little bit more than that. And then I think probably the other really important role to point out is the role of the people manager. So, you know, earlier I was talking about how change is experienced by every individual. And it's a bit mind-blowing when we say, okay, you can have a change management process. You can even have some change management specialists in your organization. The key to this is to help each individual through their own change journey. And in most organizations, that's the point where they say, that's been a lovely training course. Thank you, goodbye, because that's just, you know, it's just too much to take on. But if we can help them to see that the secret passage with this is through the line manager, and that if we really help that line manager to realize their potential in managing change, that shifts the experience for the frontline member of staff, that's when they get really interested in, could we do some more of this? So I think with those two roles, the leadership roles and the management roles, there's a tipping point that you come to with regards to them embracing these new practices around change management. And at the tipping point is where they start to get excited about the changes that they can now be successful with if they apply this good practice, and the changes that they won't have to do again and again and again because they weren't successful last time. So I guess I would highlight those two key roles, in addition to the individual, the roles of senior leaders and line managers.
I think that's a really good point. And distinction to point out, and I do have a follow-up question on that. As you mentioned earlier, Rhiannon, that there might be a situation where they just look at what you've just done as a piece of training, and after they finish the process, they're done with it, and then that's it. I'm good. Let's go back to the way things are. So how do you ensure that whatever you have taught or whatever you shared continues to be implemented, and the ideas continue to kind of stay within the organization? Yeah.
Yeah, so again, I don't think there's one answer to that, Daylon, because I think it differs from one organization to the other. And in fact, one of the things that I think I know we encourage the people that we're working with in external organizations, we encourage them to think about their big picture plan for their change management maturity. So we have a change management maturity model that we use. that has 5 levels of maturity. And by getting people to reflect on that, you're already getting them to think about, you know, are we in this for the long haul? And therefore, how can we do this in a stepwise place? But I wanted to add, you know, because you'll notice that we talk about process, but I'm always very keen also to come back to some more connectedness type thoughts. And I'm just in the process of a very beautiful piece of work where I think the people who are participating thought this was all going to be about training and learning. And what we've done with that particular piece of work is we are shifting from a beginning piece where we shared material that could be learned with templates and that kind of thing, moved it into a piece of work where we were doing more role play and interaction, trying things out, being in the sandpit, if you like, and playing with it. And actually now we're moving on into one-to-one coaching. So the coaching piece, I'm a great advocate of coaching, because the coaching is what really gives the individual the opportunity to own it for themselves. So I'd love to be able to do that kind of work with every customer, but as you can imagine, you know, not everybody's kind of up for all those 3 steps, but I thought it was worth sharing that anyway.
I think the other thing to add as well, Daylon, is that we don't train abstract theory. What we train is the application of a structured process and a set of tools to a real project. So people bring their real projects to our training programs. They don't come along to learn some fancy theory. We're talking about what people walk away with is a presentation that they can use to explain the value of change management to their boss or the senior most person responsible for that specific change. And so it's very much any training that we deliver is done in the context that's relevant to them, because otherwise for us, training is a waste of time. If you can't connect the training to your day-to-day context and what you spend your time working on, there's no point going on the training course. And so we try very hard to make that connection during any intervention that we do with people.
So what I'm hearing so far is the practicality of the training, which is bringing a problem into the program, as well as follow-up sessions post-training that in an ideal implementation and scenario, the customer would, of course, want all of these follow-up sessions that help the change to be implemented in the organization. Great.
And I think the other thing to add is that our philosophy around this, I think, is important. And the philosophy is that the best people to deliver effective change in an organization are the people in the organization themselves, not somebody from outside the organization, right? Because there's so many case studies of external consultants coming into an organization, trying to help that organization and then leaving with something that's partially complete or hasn't quite delivered all of the results that were expected, and the learning has not been embedded within the organization. So what we are doing is very much trying to teach people to fish rather than fishing for them.
I think that's such an important distinction, because not only do you get more ownership in the organization, but you also sort of build more allies in this process, and of course allow and enable the organization to sustain that change. Yeah.
And then the reason that's important is it links back to what Rhiannon was saying about the maturity of the organization that changed. So let me give you, because the research and the methodology that we use is based upon research. And Rhiannon mentioned the change maturity model and the 5 levels. At level 1, if you're a level 1 organization with very low change maturity, hardly doing any structured change management at all, what the data says is that something like 37% of your projects are meeting their objectives, their desired objectives. Whereas if you are a level 5 organization who has embedded change management throughout all of the different roles within the organization, from the executive leadership through the middle management layers and everywhere in between, the project success rate that you have is around about 66%. So that's a big difference, 37 to 66. If you imagine, and that difference is a lot of money, is a lot of financial return for an organization and competitiveness for an organization. And that is why CEOs are interested in change management. They're not interested in it as a way to be nice to people or to look after people. They're interested in it because it can help them change faster and change in new directions faster than their competitors can. And it's through instilling and embedding all of those tools and techniques throughout the whole organization that you get the benefit.
I think that's an important thing I also observed and noticed as you were sharing it, that it's not just the role of a few specific individuals. Maybe their title is called change manager, or their secondary designation is change agent. So it's not just their role, but it's everyone's responsibility at a level 5 maturity, right?
Yeah, we don't like the term change manager. We actually always insist on change management practitioner, because you're a practitioner and your job is to enable others to successfully go through change. As a change manager, if you're called the change manager, magically people think you're going to deliver the change. It's impossible for any one individual to deliver a complex change that may impact thousands of people. You've got to enable the whole organization to do that. And the people that are listened to in the organization are the people at the top and my direct boss. I listen to the boss at the top and my direct boss, and I don't really listen to too many other people. So we need to equip my boss and the bosses at the top with the skills, the capability to lead change well.
I'm really loving the distinctions so far, and those in the audience, if you love the distinctions that are being mentioned, please show some reaction buttons. I think our speakers will definitely appreciate it. And actually, we do have a question from an audience member. And she's saying she happens to be a change manager. Sorry about that. As a change manager, what if you as a change manager are doubtful of the value of change, say new technology adoption, but you're the one who have to bring people along in the journey of change? She does sound like quite lost. So yeah, what advice would you give her?
So I'll give an answer. I'm sure Rhiannon will give a slightly different one as well. So I'm the leader of our organization. And what I recognize my job is to do very often is to explain why we are changing and why we can't stay as we are, and what are the consequences to us if we don't change successfully. So I spend a lot of my time trying to think up what are the answers to those questions and to communicate them regularly and consistently to people in our organization as we go through change. And the other thing that I spend a lot of time trying to do is to think about what's in it for my senior leaders and my managers in the organization to personally take part in these changes. How does it help them achieve their objectives and what they're looking to get from doing their job here, if this change is to be successful? So my role as a leader is to articulate the answers to those why questions and also come up with the what's in it for me answers for the managers who are going to be my key change agents in the team. So back to the question, if you've been appointed as a change manager and you don't believe or understand the reasons why this change is being implemented, you need to put on your bulletproof jacket and try and have a polite conversation with the senior most person responsible for this change and ask them to explain to you, why are we doing it? What are we looking to achieve from this change? Why can't we stay as we are today? And what's in it for me and some of the other leaders who are being impacted by this change, because the answers to those questions are going to be critical in your role as a change manager to getting other people on board with the change. And by the way, nobody is listening to you as the change manager. They're going to be listening to the boss at the top and their boss. So your job as the change manager is to make sure you have good answers to those questions, and then support the boss at the top and the middle managers in communicating those answers consistently and repeatedly to people who are impacted by the change.
That's wonderful. Rhiannon, any additional points of view?
Yeah, so let me go into something that's a bit complementary, and I'm looking at that question again. There might be some people listening who know me already, so you already know this about me, which is that I started my career 35 years ago as a software developer. I know a lot of people don't think software existed 35 years ago, but it did. And, we were saying the same things 35 years ago as we say today, which is technology is the answer. So in looking at that question, I'm looking at the question in a slightly different way, which is that this is not necessarily a question about why are we making a change, or even what is it we're trying to achieve, but how are we trying to achieve that? And I think it's a really good point, because there's a popularization of a view that technology is going to be the solution. Whereas I think most of us understand that technology is a tool. It's a hammer, it's a ladder, it's a microwave oven. Technology really is just an enabling tool. And so I think in looking at this question where it's about new technology adoption, there's quite a few pieces that we would want to unpack. So there's a question about the newness and therefore the evidence base for whether this tool is going to do the job. There's the adoption. Is this tool something that our people will be able to adopt in a relatively comfortable way? And then there's the question about, is this a technology change? So if we think this is a technology change, we are really not understanding, because we only make changes that are in the interests of the vision, mission, and strategy of the organization. If we think that we are making a technology change because we've got the latest and greatest technology, so we should just do it, then it's going to be a real struggle to connect that for people in the organization. So, I hope it's useful to unpack it like that. So I don't want anybody to think that I don't think that technology is a wonderful tool. I do. I think the right technology designed and deployed in a way that is truly connected to the purpose for which that organization exists, and which is attuned to help the people in the organization realize their potential. Fantastic. But there's a lot there.
I'm so glad this is recorded, because I think that's just go over there. Like, I mean, I haven't heard someone unpack it in such a manner. I think personally, as someone who educate people in user experience design and have worked in the technology field myself, technology is a tool, as you mentioned, and at the end of the day, it should go back to the why of the organization and why it fundamentally exists, and how it should unlock the human potential, right? In this case, to achieve the mission of the organization. I think that's such an important distinction that we forget, and it's not just about play acting this change, but it's also, it has to serve everyone in this process. But knowing this now, I mean, it's like you can't unsee it. So how would you then go about helping maybe someone understand it, like, yeah, like, I mean, especially if you're in the middle management, and I believe most people here are in the middle management, it's really quite intimidating to just go to senior management, even if you have a bulletproof vest, to just go and tell them that, do you have any tips for maybe more junior people to speak to a senior leader, like, and persuade them? Yeah.
Yeah, so let me go first on this one, Daylon, if that's okay, because actually there was a word that you used there that is probably the opposite of what we would encourage people to do. So you used the word tell. And actually, what we would encourage people to do is not tell, but ask. So the fact is that many of our leaders find themselves in a very uncomfortable place. They are people with good intent, and they are facing a whole range of pressures. And so they actually, for the most part, I'm not saying everybody, because we've got some odd people out there, particular people, but I would say most of the leaders that I came across are very appreciative of being supported with questions. And these questions are questions that are not judgmental, are genuinely open, that share in that good intent, and that lead into a more of a discovery conversation, so that it feels as if it doesn't matter if I'm the boss and you're the manager and he's the shop floor worker. That doesn't matter. We all have something to bring to this change situation. And one of the great ways that we can do this without feeling in conflict or without letting that power distance get in the way is to create an environment in which we encourage questions to come through. And as those questions surface, actually they find a home in terms of starting to get answered. Now, of course, some people will think, oh, she's talking about very ideal environment here and it can never be like that. And I think, great, because if we think that we can have that ideal environment, then we will behave ourselves to the environment that we want to work in. So I'm hoping that's helpful. I'm not saying it's a kind of quick and easy fix, but the simple answer to that is don't tell, ask, and ask in a way that is non-judgmental and assumes good intent.
That's an excellent point. Do you have an example of a question that is non-judgmental? Just so we make it an example and people can remember it.
What do you mean by that?
Are you asking me? Is that the question, or do you mean, what do you mean by that? That's the question. That's the question. Okay, so it's a clarifying question.
Yeah, so generally open questions, questions that are about encouraging that person to surface more of their thinking. There's obviously there'll be people out there who have learned coaching and therefore have access to lots of questions that you can ask, but I think the general principle is about asking open questions that and then leaving the space for that person to not just answer and then move on, but then to allow that person to share, discover a bit more for themselves. So the CEO that Michael's talking about, I mean, Michael has had this experience himself, which is that he can be asked a question by somebody and that question immediately makes him feel quite threatened, because it feels like that person is trying to catch him out. And worse still, he knows he doesn't have a nice, neat answer for this. But if somebody asks him that question in a different way, in a way that says, let's share some understanding here, let's explore this together, that's unthreatening. And actually for Michael, wow, he wants to see that person again. So, you came at this from the perspective of the people that we might have in the audience and the power distance. This will still be scary because it's a new way of approaching something. I would encourage people just to start trying it gently. Actually, you can try it at home. You don't even need to try it with your CEO. You can try it in a more friendly environment to start off with.
Yeah, I think the other thing to add to this is what's clear both from the data and any anecdotal evidence is that many senior leaders, and I would include myself in that as well, have imposter syndrome. They can't quite believe that they've been able to get away with doing this job that they do every day, and they don't know all the answers to all of the questions that people are asking them continuously. And so what they try and do is to either fake it a little bit, or if they're hopefully a bit more mature, recognize that they don't have all of the answers and are open to being challenged and being helped by other people, because it's the power of the group is much more powerful than the power of one single individual to solve problems. And I think we are starting to see in many organizations more of a breakdown of the traditional hierarchical ways of working and more towards self-organizing teams where the team is given the job of developing and deploying a change and getting the rest of the organization on board with those changes. And I think that's a positive momentum. And I think that's really changing the landscape of how we need to see everyone in the organization as delivering significant value to the future of that organization.
I think that's really great, and I would say it's very in line to just give it a try in a social setting, which is not threatening and doesn't carry a lot of risk, and to practice and be comfortable asking non-judgmental questions, which are very valid, especially when coming with the right intent, right? Because when we ask it with intent to challenge someone, that could come off in a wrong way and be taken in a wrong way. I was wondering whether this is related to an audience question. Your answer is related to an audience question right here. How do you deal with people within a team who resist change? Let's say a team of 5 and one person really makes it difficult for the rest. Do you just encourage them? Do you just encourage the 4 people to ask this one person what's going on?
I think that might seem a little accusatory, so maybe not. But I would want to have a one-on-one conversation with that person to understand their point of view, what they feel nervous or why they feel threatened by this change, if that's the way that they feel, and to understand or to get an appreciation of if they understand why we are going through this change and why we can't stay as we are and why we have to change now, and if they think there is enough in it for them to participate in the change. We can't force anybody to change. There will be some people who will just not change no matter what you do, but so long as they have a voice and are heard and are given all the information and support that they need to try and make a positive choice for the change, that's good enough. If I can get somebody to say, yes, I don't like this change, and even though I've heard all of the information about why we have to do it, but for the good of the organization, I will reluctantly choose to participate in the change. For me, that's good enough. That's a result, right? We don't need to get beyond that with everybody within the organization. Hopefully we can have more people that are more positive than that. But if I can get the majority of people to actively take part, even with some reluctance, that's good enough for me.
Yeah. Sounds like it's not about cracking the whip.
No, the one thing that comes out from all of the data is that disciplining people or sending them for a harsh conversation with HR or whatever you do, or is and ignoring the resistance to change does not work. Those are not viable strategies. You have to surface it, and actually the earlier you surface it in the life cycle of the change, the more likely you are to be able to deal with it. And one of the best ways of dealing with resistance is by having clear and consistent answers to those questions about why. Because we are all, you know, if any of us that have children, you ask your child to do something, what do they ask you? Why? You give them an answer, why? You know, so we all try and think of 5 answers to the why questions, you know, really get down to the depth of what is holding that person back from participating in this change by asking them the why questions and just listening to the answers.
That's wonderful. Over to you, Rhiannon. And do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I was going to share with everybody a very sweeping statement, which is that most people in most organizations in most of the world are okay with accepting or even being enthusiastic about changing their way of working. So this question, even in the way it's been phrased, 1 out of 5, we can see it's an exception question. So I think that's the first thing to mention, which is don't let yourself get overwhelmed with the exceptions. Honestly, when it comes to adopting and using new ways of working, it really is a bit of a numbers game. When enough people go along with a new way of working, what you find is you're getting most of the benefits, and you're also getting some of the people who thought they were exceptions no longer wanting to be exceptions. There's lots and lots of studies around group behavior. We might not like to think it, but you know, we are people who want to belong. And so actually it's so fascinating to see how that sense of belonging, even, you know, regardless of all the other stuff that we've been talking about, that sense of belonging might sometimes bring that person along. However, there are exceptions. So in the framework, the change management framework that we use, we have some ways to help you identify resistance, diagnose resistance, and then some tactics for how you can manage resistance. So in this case, where we've got this one person, I guess what I would be saying is, I'd love to know a little bit more about how are you identifying that resistance? How is it manifesting itself? And then what's your diagnosis for that resistance? Because only then can you go on to look at the tactics. And, you know, of course, this could be really an issue to do with the change itself, but it could just be to do with the individual. They might have a very, very difficult personal situation going on. And actually, they're not being resistant. They are just, this is just self-preservation. They're just trying to take care of themselves. So yes, I don't want to go on at length about that, but I think, you know, hopefully there's a few practical things to leave people thinking about. I would just, with that question that's been asked, there were a couple of interesting pieces of language there. Deal with was interesting, and difficult was interesting. So going back to those questions, Daylon, I would be saying, what do you mean by deal with?
I think that's a really great point. I think it's also important. Well, it's back to intentionality. As I'm sensing and hearing your perspectives and experiences, I'm really seeing how much care you both put into the engagement when dealing with the individual. And I think that is so important, because changing the individual, you don't know how that could sort of like have a spillover effect on the rest of the organization. I'm also wondering, well, is this in conflict, or is this in misalignment with, you know, systems, right? And looking at things from a systems level or an organization level. You know, like, what if you have a really huge organization of like 10,000 people? This still scalable? Because yeah, I just out of curiosity.
Yeah, so the tools and processes that we use are definitely scalable. They're in use by the I think something like 70% of the Fortune 100 largest organizations. So yeah, who are dealing with multiple changes of thousands of people at the same time. You know, you have a unit within an organization going through 6 or 8 changes to their ways of working, and that impacting several thousand people at the same time. So yeah, definitely those approaches are scalable, but the building block of that methodology is, how do you do change with one person at a time? And then how do you do change successfully in a single initiative, a single project? And that's where people have to start, and that's the foundation of what we teach. There's a methodology that ProSci teach, which is called ADKAR, which stands for Awareness, Desire, Knowledge, Ability, and Reinforcement. And that's the sequence that we all go through as individuals when confronted by a change. And so that's a foundation of how you can take one person through change. And then ADKAR then becomes a foundation as to how you do that on a whole project, where you may be taking thousands of people through change. So ADKAR gives a language and a measurement system for how well and how many people are adopting the change and where they are in that process at any one time. And that's the foundation of what we teach. So yes, it is directly scalable.
And if I were to ask for some tips and additional advice, I think I would like to ask it from, say, the perspective of a manager, right? A people manager. What can a people manager do to be an effective sponsor or effective leader in this process of change? And I think you've been giving a lot of advice for the employees. So what can a people manager do to support this process?
Yeah, we typically say that a people manager has 5 roles in change, and we'll help you remember what those roles are if you can remember the character of Superman. So if anybody wants to type in what was the name of the character of Superman in the Superman movies, if any of you remember that. But the 5 roles are: managers need to be great communicators. They need to explain the reasons why we're doing the change. They need to be a great liaison. They need to connect back regularly with the project team or the change team on how well the change is going for them and their people, or what information do they need to help it go better. They need to be an advocate for that change, a personal advocate for that change, and think it's a good idea. They need to be a great resistance manager and be able to manage their own resistance in going through the change, as well as their team members' resistance. And finally, they need to be a great coach. They need to be able to show their people what it is they need to, how to get through the change. Coaching is, Rhiannon's more of a coach than I am, but I always think that coaching is not about doing something for somebody. It's more about explaining how that person can find the answer to their question themselves. And so that's what those 5 skills, which we can remember with the abbreviation CLARC, and Clark Kent, for any of you that remember Superman, that helps you remember the 5 roles that we expect people managers within an organization to go through. That actually communicating to managers that they have a role in change and there is an expectation for them to do that is often very big news for managers. They don't believe or understand unless somebody has often told them that that is a responsibility that they need to carry. And so it takes time for many managers to take that on board for themselves. And we recognize that in the way in which we teach managers how to go through change, because we say, a bit like when you go on the airline, do you remember when we used to fly and they say, put your own mask on before helping somebody else? So what we recognize is that managers themselves have to get themselves through the change before they can properly help any of their team members. So early on in a change project, it's important to get as many of those middle managers, the senior middle managers, on board with the change before we then expect them to introduce and lead the change with their people.
Thanks for sharing. And Rhiannon, since we're at the end of our webinar and our podcast session, any parting advice or points of view?
Well, maybe I'll just, in order to build up on what Michael's just said, maybe I'm just going to mention that advocate role. And I'm going to connect the advocate role with another A word, which is authenticity. So one of the questions that I get asked a lot is, as a manager or a leader, how can I advocate for this change when I don't agree with it? So when I get that asked that question, then I go back to what Michael raised before, which is if you're in that position, then actually you need to take it on yourself to go and have conversations that give you more opportunity to find value in the change. If it's something that you feel compromises your authenticity, so an example is, quite often if we're in a more open environment, there can have been a debate about what we're going to do and how we should do it. If I've been very vocal about that and then we didn't do it my way, how do I now go back to my team and not lose face when everybody knows that I disagreed with this change? So I wanted to raise that advocate word because I think that's has a massive impact for everybody in the organization in being able to continue to be their authentic selves. And when we're talking about advocating for a change, actually we need to connect it to our responsibility to the organization. So unless you're a volunteer, you are being paid to do a job by an organization. And that organization has decided to make a change. And you may or may not have been involved in the decision about how that change is going to be made, but you are still standing in a job where you signed up to serving the organization. And so in that advocacy piece, you have to find your authentic voice in this change to support yourself and to support others in going through that transition. So I guess what my kind of closing thought is, change management isn't about making people happy. Change management is about helping all of us fulfill our responsibility in a way that allows us to retain our authenticity.
That's really great. And Michael, any statement?
A quick thing I'd say is that I think the perspective here in this conversation that we've had is that change is really difficult, and it is. But I think if we were to try to put that sense of difficulty aside and actually think that change is exciting and fun, and really focus on the positive outcomes that could come from change, all of us could reimagine a slightly better future and our part in it. And I think so much of it comes from our mindset and attitude towards change, and not seeing it as difficult and negative and a challenge, but more seeing it as an opportunity and something that's positive for ourselves and our organization. That makes, back to Rhiannon's analogy, that is the water on the water slide. That makes the change much easier than we might otherwise imagine.
And with that, I think that's such an excellent closing statement. I took away so much from this short conversation with both of you. And I think I'm leaving with very refreshed perspectives and distinctions on how to see change. And I see that both of you do it with so much care. And I hope the audience members here would also come to work with this process with that care and attention on the individual as well. And one thing I really took away is connecting it back to the overall mission of the organization. I think that's such an important distinction to take away. Rhiannon Cooke and Michael Campbell, thank you both for taking time to share your experiences, and your stories with us. And we really appreciate the learnings that you've sort of synthesized for us in the last hour.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.